Part 3. Can a dead man come back to life? Chapter 7. Did Jesus fake his death? A friend was telling me about Jonathan, a little kid she knows. Jonathan lives on a busy street, and he likes to sit in his front yard and watch the cars and trucks drive by. One day, Jonathan said to his dad, "I know how to make concrete." "Oh," replied Jonathan's dad, "how's that?" "You make it from squirrels," Jonathan said. Noting his dad's look of surprise, he explained. "See, first a squirrel runs into the road, and then it gets hit by a car. Then more cars and more cars drive over it, and in a couple of days, when you look where the squirrel was, it's concrete." Jonathan may have not had a very accurate understanding of the composition of concrete or the decomposition of squirrels, but he did get one thing absolutely right. When roadkill disappears, it's not because it came back to life. Yet Christianity claims that Jesus did exactly that. According to the New Testament, Jesus was run over by the force of the Roman government, which authorized the most horrifying form of capital punishment known in that day. His body lay dead for most of 3 days. Then, according to Christian belief, instead of decomposing, he came back to life. Christ's resurrection, his coming back to life, is considered the ultimate proof that he is God. So it's too important a claim either to accept mindlessly or dismiss without looking at it seriously. Before someone can be resurrected from the dead, of course, the person has to be dead. So the first question to ask is, did Jesus really die on the cross? Or might he have faked his own death and the resurrection that appeared to follow? Stunned. There's a family in Chicago area that likes to visit relatives in Ontario, Canada, every year during Christmas break. Because the weather can be unpredictable and the roads pretty treacherous around the Great Lakes at that time of year, they usually take Amtrak. But almost every trip, it seems, something weird happens to delay their arrival. One Christmas, it was a cow. Zipping along through rural Wisconsin, the passengers suddenly felt a jolt, then a lurch, and then the train shuddered to a squealing halt. When they looked out the window, the family could see train officials and one very angry farmer rushing to the motionless body of a cow. It seems the cow had been on the tracks when the train hit it. The cow was thrown clear to where it now lay, half submerged in a snowbank. Apparently, the paperwork involved in a head-on cow collision is significant, because the train sat on the tracks for a long time. When it finally started to move again, the Chicago family went to the end car for one final look at the scene of the accident. The last thing they saw as the train pulled away was the cow, staggering to its feet, twitching a few times, and plodding right back onto the train tracks. Would you conclude from the evidence that A, the cow was miraculously raised from the dead, or B, the cow had been merely stunned and eventually revived? Option B would be my choice regarding the cow, and not surprisingly, it used to be a pretty popular choice regarding Jesus' apparent death as well. Resurrected or revived. One solution to the problem of a dead person coming back to life is the suggestion that Jesus didn't really die on the cross at all, but that he either fainted from exhaustion or took a drug that made him look dead. Later, he revived in the cool, damp air of the tomb. Here are some of the arguments in favor of that theory. The Bible itself tells us that Jesus was offered some liquid on a sponge when he was on the cross. See Mark 15:36. If the sponge were drugged, Jesus might appear dead when in fact he was only heavily sedated. The Bible also says that Pilate was surprised at how soon Jesus died. Mark 15:44, which could suggest that Jesus was taken off the cross before his crucifixion proved fatal. This theory explains how Jesus' tomb could be empty. There was no corpse to bury. And how could Jesus walk and talk and eat with people after his crucifixion? Death by torture. The other theory, of course, is that Jesus did die on the cross. Arguments in favor of that theory include details about just what was involved in the events leading up to the crucifixion, as well as crucifixion itself. Sweating blood. Luke wrote that when Jesus was praying before he was arrested, his sweat was like drops of blood. See Luke 22:44. That sounds like exaggeration at the very least. Not the kind of medical accuracy you would hope from a doctor, which is what Luke was. But it turns out that doctors today recognize a rare medical condition. It's called hematidrosis. That looks like what Luke described. What happens is that high anxiety causes certain chemicals to release into the capillaries in the sweat glands. These chemicals break down the capillaries, very tiny blood vessels, so that there's a small amount of bleeding right in the sweat glands. When the sweat comes out, it's tinged with blood. Under the whip. In 1994, an American teenager named Michael Fay made international news when he was convicted of vandalizing cars with spray paint in Singapore. The penalty for his crime was caning. Many Americans had never heard of caning before, but before long, anyone who cared to find out had learned that caning is a specific punishment involving striking the offender's bare buttocks with a rattan cane. The process is very consistent. The cane used is 1.2 meters long and 13 millimeters thick. The person being caned bends over an H-shaped rack, and the caner strikes a blow roughly every 30 seconds. Like caning in Singapore, flogging in the Roman Empire followed a predictable and consistent pattern. The soldier would use a whip of braided leather thongs with metal balls woven into them. When the whip would strike the flesh, these balls could cause deep bruises which would break open with further blows. And the whip had pieces of sharp bone as well, which would cut into the flesh. The back of the person being flogged would be so shredded that part of the spine was sometimes exposed by the deep cuts. The lash of the whip would go all the way from the shoulders down the back to the buttocks and the back of the legs. The whip would tear into underlying muscles to produce quivering ribbons of bleeding flesh, and sometimes even expose internal organs. Usually, flogging consisted of 39 lashes, although a soldier might inflict more depending on his mood. Many people died from flogging even before they could be crucified. Those who didn't die often went into shock. See box, state of shock. By the time the soldiers were done flogging Jesus, he would have been in serious condition, even before the first nail was driven in to hang him on the cross. State of shock. A flogging victim may go into shock as a result of losing so much blood. 4 things happen to the body in this state of shock. The heart races to try to pump blood that isn't there. Blood pressure drops, causing the victim to faint or collapse. The kidneys stop producing urine to maintain the volume of fluid left in the body. The person becomes very thirsty as the body craves fluids to replace the lost blood volume. Jesus showed signs of at least 2 of these symptoms. When he collapsed while carrying his cross so that the soldiers ordered Simon of Cyrene to carry it for him, and when he said, "I'm thirsty," while hanging on the cross. On the cross. These days, when condemned criminals are strapped down and interjected with poison, or secured to a wooden chair and subjected to a surge of electricity, their circumstances are highly controlled. Death is so certain that a death row criminal on the way to execution chamber is referred to as a dead man walking. But how certain was death by the crude, slow, and rather inexact form of execution on a cross? Most people aren't sure just how crucifixion kills its victims, and without a trained medical examiner to officially call the time and cause of death, might Jesus have escaped the experience? Brutalized and bleeding, but nevertheless alive? To answer these questions for myself, I looked into the actual process of crucifixion. When Jesus arrived at the site where he was to be crucified, he would have been laid down with his arms outstretched on a large beam. When the executioner would have taken the 2 sharp spikes, each 5 to 7 inches long, then nailed them through each wrist into the beam. Hands or wrists. Nearly all the pictures of Jesus on the cross show the nails going through Jesus' palms, probably because the Bible mentions nail marks in Jesus' hands, in John 20:25. But actually, the Roman drove the spikes into their victims' wrists, which was considered part of the hand. The bones in the palm aren't strong enough to hold the weight of a human's body as it sagged onto the cross. The nails would have shredded right through the palms, and the victim would have fallen off the cross. As the nails pierced the wrists, they would have crushed the large nerve that goes to the hand. If you have ever banged your funny bone, you've experienced what it is to jar a nerve. Imagine taking a pliers and squeezing the nerve in your funny bone, and you have some idea of the pain the spikes in the wrist caused. For this first step of the process, the horizontal beam was lying on the ground, not yet attached to the vertical beam. At this point, Jesus was hoisted as the crossbar was attached to the vertical stake. And then the executioner drove nails through Jesus' feet, crushing and severing the nerves there. The word excruciating means agonizingly painful, which comes from the word crucifixion. Immediately, Jesus' arms would have been stretched by the weight of his body hanging on them. Scientists tell us that his arms would have been pulled about 6 inches longer. Both shoulders would have been dislocated by the strain put on them, the cause of death. Severed nerves and dislocated joints don't necessarily kill a person. Once a person is hanging in the vertical position, crucifixion is essentially an agonizingly slow death by asphyxiation. In order to exhale, the person being crucified must push up on his feet. When he did that, the nails would tear through his feet until they eventually locked up against the ankle bones. After he managed to exhale, the person would then be able to relax down and take another breath in. Again, he'd have to push himself up to exhale, scraping his bloodied back against the rough wood of the cross. This would go on until complete exhaustion would take over and the person wouldn't be able to push up and breathe anymore. As the person's breathing is slowed down, the lack of oxygen would lead to an erratic heartbeat and eventually cardiac arrest. Water and blood. The combination of shock, a rapid heart rate, and heart failure result in a collection of clear, watery fluid around the heart and lungs. An incision through the lungs and heart would release that fluid as well as blood. The Apostle John described this medical phenomenon in his account of the crucifixion when he wrote that one of the soldiers pierced Jesus' side with a spear, bringing a sudden flow of blood and water. John 19:34. Dead or alive. Dr. William D. Edwards, writing in the Journal of American Medical Association, drew this conclusion about the crucifixion. Clearly, the weight of the historical and medical evidences indicates that Jesus was dead before the wound to his side was inflicted. The assumption that Jesus did not die on the cross appears to be at odds with modern medical knowledge. You can draw your own conclusions. What clinched it for me was this question: suppose Jesus did survive the cross. Suppose he was able to escape from the burial wrappings, roll the rock away from the tomb, and get past the Roman soldiers who were standing guard. After suffering the trauma of the cross and such catastrophic blood loss, would he have inspired the disciples to hail him as a victorious conqueror of death? Would they have been motivated to start a worldwide movement based on the hope that someday they too would have a post-crucifixion body just like this? My own conclusion, after weighing the evidence, was to rule out the theory that Jesus didn't really die on the cross. That suggestion no longer seemed plausible. But remember, the central claim of Christianity is not just Jesus' death, but his resurrection. Agreeing that Jesus was dead is still a long way from agreeing that he came back to life. A question for the heart. What could possibly have motivated Jesus to willingly allow himself to be degraded and brutalized the way he was?